Continuing on with the kitchen remodel from my last video, in this one I'm building a whole new custom island. Starting with this 3/4 inch pre-finished maple plywood that'll make up the shell of the island. The client wanted a U-shaped design so the stools can tuck up underneath when not in use. So this first piece is the bottom of the island that everything will be built up from. Then from there it's just bouncing back and forth between the track saw and table saw to get the rest of the pieces cut to size. With all the panels cut, I did a little mock-up to get a game plan on how I wanted to assemble it, and decided to drill some pocket holes on just a couple of the pieces where they won't be seen in the end. Next up, before I could assemble, since I'm using pre-finished plywood, I wanted to sand that finish back to raw wood so I could use glue and it actually stick and work. Then to attach the pieces, I flipped the cabinet over on its face so I could drive most of the screws in from the bottom. Notice on these two inside panels I'm using red oak plywood rather than the pre-finished. The rest of the island is getting scanned in oak framed panels, but on these two pieces, these flat panels are the final pieces that you'll see from the outside. That'll make more sense as I keep going, but just real quick again, like I explained in the last video, even though this is being painted white, I'm still using oak so that the grain will match the existing kitchen cabinets. I always give all the options, but in this case the client preferred and wanted to keep the oak grain. Anyways, I had plenty of pre-finished 1/4 inch plywood that I'll be using for the drawer bottoms as well, so to keep the inside of the cabinet all matchy-matchy and looking clean, I went ahead and got these oak panels faced, just using a combo of wood glue and CA glue to hold the panels quickly. Continuing on, just getting the two outer end panels and then all the middle dividers attached. With the main carcass done, next up was milling all the red oak for the face frame, doors and drawers, and outer frame and panels. So lots of milling. Alrighty, with everything cut down to final size, I could start on the joinery. This is the same for the cabinet doors and the outer panels that'll wrap the island, just with bigger pieces. Using a Freud tongue and groove router bit set, I first run every piece through face down to create the groove on the inside edge. Then after that, I switch over bits and run all the rails through, which are the horizontal pieces, to make the tongues on each end. After cutting all the 1/4 inch plywood center panels to size, I could start getting these glued up. On this large back panel, I went ahead and did this one in 2 stages to make clamping easier. First, just getting those center stiles and panel glued in. Next up was drilling pocket holes and getting the face frame assembled. The number one tip here is to use scrap spacer blocks, or in some cases like here I can use the actual other pieces of the frame to line up and know where to attach the pieces. Just helps a lot to make sure your openings come out even and square. Moving back to adding the 2 outer stiles on this big panel, I do have some connectors to use with Bessie parallel clamps to make them massive, but I figured I'd show another way you can clamp stuff up just by using shims. In this case, my outfeed table ended up being the perfect size, so I just used a couple trigger clamps as stop blocks, but on my other table, I've just screwed some blocks down to it before, and then you can just use the shims to push your pieces together and hold until the glue dries. Works awesome and is great if you don't have a ton of clamps. Before I added all the pretty panels to the cabinet, I figured I better flip this thing over for the last time and finish up the bottom. The client's kitchen was big enough for an island, but not really, you know what I mean? Plenty of room to pull it out and use when guests come over, but not ideal to have it sitting in the middle of the kitchen 90% of the time. So she had the idea to make it mobile so they could do exactly that. It's not something I had seen before, but looking around online it seems to be a pretty common and good solution. So to make it mobile, we obviously needed some casters, and they needed to be big enough to support an island this big, along with the quartz countertop. But she didn't really want to see them, so I'm adding basically a toe kick all around, which is just a valance to hide the casters. I sized this to where it's just barely off the floor so it can still freely move, but isn't really even noticeable. It's been a couple months now, so I should have asked if she even finds herself using this and locking the casters, but we figured it was important to have access to. So on the 2 end pieces, I put those on a hinge with a couple push-to-open magnet latches. I worked with as tight of tolerances as I could, so again it's barely even noticeable, but this gives her an easy way to reach in and at least lock a couple of the casters if she needs. With that done, I could flip it back over and get all the outside panels glued and screwed on. Where these outside butt joints come together, rather than trying to make that seamless, sometimes it's a better idea to purposely accentuate the seam, and I'm doing so here with just a small 1/16 inch roundover on each piece. So it's just a slight detail, but it's there on purpose. For one, I don't want to use Bondo or wood filler to hide the seam, since that'll fill in surrounding wood grain and make it really noticeable. And with this being painted white, it's wood, it's going to shift and move a little, and when it does, the paint line at that seam could crack. Then there's going to be a noticeable black line there. This way, that paint line is hidden back in the small groove and you can't see it. So just a good little tip and detail to keep in mind for certain things. Now to attach the face frame, I'm able to clamp around the outside edges, but a good trick to be able to clamp in the middle is by just partially driving in a couple screws inside the cabinet that your clamp can hold on. In this case, I just figured out where the drawer slides would be mounted, so I could put the screws there, then they can be removed and the holes later hidden and no one's the wiser. But a couple little screw holes isn't a big deal regardless. Next up was adding this base molding around the bottom of the cabinet. Just another layer of detail, and it's the same molding I used in other areas of the kitchen, so this ties it all together. After cutting the drawer fronts to size, I could finish adding the details on those and the doors to match the existing kitchen cabinets. First using this door lip router bit on the outside edges, then there's a back bevel cut on the top and bottoms. At this point, I'm just getting all the small and messy stuff done before I turn the shop into a spray booth, like drilling hinge cups in the doors and then making a groove in all the drawer box parts. Here I'm drilling adjustable shelf pin holes, and I made some L-shaped shelves, say that 3 times fast, for inside the 2 cabinet doors. I figured this extra deep space on the ends could actually be some really useful storage for longer items. And shout out to those 90-degree drill adapters for making this possible. Last messy thing was making some support brackets for the countertop where that big opening is. I asked my dad if he had any scrap 3/8 steel laying around. He didn't, but he did have some 1/2-inch stainless steel at work, so that's awesome and definitely overkill. Now this thing is not light by any means, and no way I could move it myself. So that's what's great about these zip wall poles. I just left it there and made a spray booth around it. I didn't have room for the camera tripod. It's actually on the outside poking through a hole in the plastic here, so sorry for not much video on this, but 2 coats of shellac primer and 2 coats of General Finishes white poly, sanding in between every coat with 320 grit. Rather than sitting around watching paint dry, it's always good to plan steps out, so in between coats I can keep moving here by getting edge bending applied to all the drawer box parts. A clean process so I'm not kicking up dust around the shop, and progress continues. I'm using the pre-finished plywood here again, but the edge banding isn't. So to finish that to match, I like to just tightly stack the pieces and use some rattle can lacquer. We're on the home stretch here, getting the drawers assembled and slides installed. With face frame cabinets, somewhere you're going to have to pack out one of the sides so the drawer slides are flush with the face frame. I like to cut my fillers the same width as the slides, and then you can see my height spacers that I'm using to set the slides on, It's thick enough to where I'm able to set both the filler and the slide on it, so it's nice and flush and easy to attach. Of course, starting at the top and then cutting the spacers as needed to work down. I put in some long days on this to get it done so the countertops could be measured and ordered, and this is kind of sad here, but pretty funny. Working along, getting the drawer fronts attached, get the top all lined up, climb up to screwed on, and there's no drawer box. So, get that put in and repeat. And where are my drills? What a dingus. Attaboy, got it done. Alright, just needed to get this beast moved to the kitchen. And she got the hardware picked out too, so I just got those installed off camera, and that's a wrap. When I was done with the job, she was actually still undecided on which side she'd have against the wall. Original plan was to have the stools hidden back against the wall, but she kinda liked having them on the outside and then just using the cabinets for storage you don't really use often. Either way, there was a need and idea, and we made it happen. Let me know if you'd like full build plans for this. Even if you just want it as a regular island without the casters, it's a great design for both. I can make that happen if a lot of you do, so if you're watching in the future, just check the description for a link for possible plans. Thanks for watching.